Now, we've been looking at how to access primary sources in order to do a word study, but clearly the same kind of process can be used to get ourselves into the historical cultural context to understand ideas and practices. So there are a number of resources that we can use to study the primary source background. And here's just one example, Yale University Library. It has a pull-down menu on finding background information, for example. Once again, you need to remember that this is these are tools, and these are the results of scholarly work, but that doesn't make them accurate. You have to check it. And here I've clicked on the Books in Biblical Studies section. There are also websites listed and so forth. This is useful information, but use it very critically. There's some stuff on here that I would not want to encourage you to use. So notice other things here, lexicon, language resources, concordances, databases, exegesis guides. Gordon Fee's New Testament exegesis is listed there. Some internet sites and so forth. The internet sites, though, on the Cooley Center go way beyond what's listed here. And so you can be aware of these other things, but try to find a place where you go to regularly to get information. Now, in our study of this issue from 1 Corinthians 6:9, one thing we want to do is go beyond just a word study and see where the concept is present as well from antiquity, to get into the historical cultural context. So my example here is from Clement of Alexandria's work, Paidagogos. The text here has two words that are translated as effeminate, but neither one is our word malakos, or related to it in any way. So we're not doing a word study here, we're doing an historical cultural context study. And it would be important to know that Clement of Alexandria is a Christian writing in Egypt in the second half of the 2nd century. So we're separated from Paul by about 150 years, and we are in a different part of the Greco-Roman Empire. However, we're still working with Greek, we're still working with the Greco-Roman Empire, and this does have some closeness, some proximity to the passage in 1 Corinthians 6, even so. So what do we find there? Clement says, "To such an extent, then, has luxury advanced, that not only are the female sex deranged about this frivolous pursuit, but men also are infected with the disease. For not being free of the love of finery, they are not in health." Okay, so he's talking about a general cultural pursuit of the soft life, we might say. He says, and men, not just women, are infected by it. But inclining to voluptuousness, they become effeminate, cutting their hair in an ungentlemanlike and meretricious way, clothed in fine and transparent garments. So they're sexually crude, you might say, in public. Chewing mastiche, smelling of perfume. Notice this is a way of life, not just an act, but a whole way of life that's in view. What can one say on seeing them? Like one who judges people by their foreheads, he will divine them to be adulterers and androgynous, male women, womanly men, rather. Effeminate is the translation here. Addicted to both kinds of venery, haters of hair, destitute of hair, detesting the bloom of manliness, and adorning their locks like women. These men are presenting themselves as women. They take hair off their bodies, they dress like women, they're acting like women. This is one aspect of a culture that is overly soft, is arguing Clement. In another part of the same work, Paidagogos, Clement of Alexandria says, "For their service, the towns are full of those who take out hair by pitch plasters, shave and pluck out hairs from these womanish creatures. And shops are erected and opened everywhere, and adepts at this meretricious fornication make a deal of money openly by those who plaster themselves, and give their hair to be pulled out in all ways by those who make it their trade, feeling no shame before the onlookers of those who approach, nor before themselves, being men. Such are those addicted to base passions, whose whole body is made smooth by the violent tuggings of pitch plasters. It is utterly impossible to get beyond such effrontery. If nothing is left undone by them, neither shall anything be left unspoken by me. Diogenes, when he was being sold, chiding like a teacher, one of these degenerate creatures, said very manfully, 'Come, youngster, buy for yourself a man,' chastising his meretriciousness by an ambiguous speech. But for those who are men to shave and smooth themselves, how ignoble! As for dyeing of hair and anointing of gray locks and dyeing them yellow, these are practices of abandoned effeminates." And we've seen this word before, androgynon. And their feminine, thelu is a basic word for female, theludriodes, combining of themselves is a thing to be let alone. For they think that, like serpents, they divest themselves of the old age of their head by painting and renovating themselves. But though they do doctor their hair cleverly, they will not escape wrinkles, nor will they elude death by tricking time. For it is not dreadful to appear old when you are not able to shut your eyes to the fact that you are so. So the passage here captures again a culture of effeminacy among certain men that Clement is observing in Egypt. Clement, in the same book and section, says, "But for one who is a man to comb himself and shave himself with a razor, for the sake of fine effects, to arrange his hair at the looking-glass, to shave his cheeks, pluck hairs out of them, and smooth them, how womanly! And in truth, unless you saw them naked, you would suppose them to be women. For although not allowed to wear gold, yet out of effeminate desire they enwreath their latches and fringes with leaves of gold, or, getting certain spherical figures of the same metal made, they fasten them to their ankles and hang them from their necks. This is a device of enervated men, who are dragging to the women's apartments amphibious and lecherous beasts, who are dragged to the women's apartments, amphibious and lecherous beasts. For this is a meretricious and impious form of snare." Now, every passage that we've read so far has talked about a soft culture that involves sexuality. It involves men presenting themselves as women in public. And yet, this passage doesn't limit this group of men to homosexuality. Here we see that it has in general to do with sexual looseness. We might say bisexuality among these men. They are amphibious and lecherous beasts, but the phrase dragged to women's apartments means that they'll go either way in their sexuality and not just limit themselves to sex with other men. From the same chapter in Clement of Alexandria and Pedagogos 3:3, we read, "This then, the mark of the man, the beard, by which he is seen to be a man, is older than Eve, and is the token of the superior nature. In this God deemed it right that he should excel, and dispersed hair over man's whole body. Whatever smoothness and softness was in him, he abstracted from his side when he formed the woman Eve, physically receptive, his partner in parentage, his help in household management, while he, for he had parted with all smoothness, remained a man, and shows himself man. And to him has been assigned action, as to her suffering. For what is shaggy is drier and warmer than what is smooth. Wherefore males have both more hair and more heat than females, animals that are entire than the emasculated, perfect than imperfect. It is therefore impious to desecrate the symbol of manhood, hairiness. But the embellishment of smoothing," and here we have a word that doesn't have molokos in it, but it's just the background, historical cultural background that we're looking at. He says, "For I am warned by the word, if it is to attract men, it is the act of an effeminate person. If it is to attract women, it is the act of an adulterer, and both must be driven as far as possible from our society." Okay. And now we can look at another passage in Clement. In this passage we read, "But life has reached this pitch of licentiousness through the wantonness of wickedness and lasciviousness is diffused over the cities, having become law. Beside them women stand in their stews, offering their own flesh for hire for lewd pleasure, and boys, taught to deny their sex, act the part of women." So pederasty is not being opposed by Clement because of the age of the boys, which is what we would refer to as pedophilia in our day, but rather it's the playing the part of women that's the key thing. It's the homosexual side of pedophilia or pederasty that Clement has in view. Now, obviously, we don't want to get everything from one text, so we need to look at other texts. And I've chosen a text that is not in Greek now, and not from the early church, but a Latin work by a satirist named Juvenal, who gives us a picture of life in this general time period as well. It's always important to look at exactly what the dates are of these authors to make sure that you're not trying to say something going on 400 years after the first century or 400 years before it is the key to interpreting something in the first century. But Juvenal is in the general time period. And here then, in his second satire, we read about different adult male homosexuals who are and are not effeminate, both engaging in anal intercourse. "How can you castigate sin when you, yourself, are the most notorious of all the Socratic sodomite holes?" This loose translation has it. And this is actually going to be pretty rough stuff. Socratic in the sense, perhaps, that Socrates was understood to have had sex with boys as well. "Though hairy members and those stiff bristles all over your arms promise a rough approach, your arse turns out to be smooth enough when the smiling doctor lances away at your swollen piles." So here's a reference to anal intercourse. And the point to be noted here is that this is not a molokos male, but it is a manly-looking male who is nevertheless engaged in homosexuality. Also, then, he's not someone who could be recognized in a certain way on the street, but rather you could say he's in the closet with his homosexual orientation and practices. Few words, continues Juvenal, and a marked urge for silence is what they possess. Hair cut shorter than their eyebrows. Parabomius, the Pathics, more open and honest than they, who admits his affliction in his looks and his walk, all of which I attribute to fate. The word Pathic here is actually related to a Greek and Latin word that is a reference to a homosexual. And what he's saying is there are some who are open about it, and they really basically look like women, the way they dress with their eyebrows, but also in this case, instead of having long hair locks like in Clement, they cut their hair really short. And you can tell by looking at them that they're advertising themselves as homosexuals. Even in his walk, you can see that he is effeminate. So we have two types of homosexual here in this passage. You might say the transvestite kind of homosexual and the male homosexual who is an adult male in this case, not a young boy, and who is hiding his sexual practices. Juvenal goes on to say, the vulnerability of such is pitiful, and their passion itself deserves our forgiveness. Far worse are those who attack them with Herculean rectitude and then waggle their bottoms while talking of virtue. So there's some who attack these practices and then themselves participate in it. How can I respect you, Sextus, when I see you wiggling your arse? Cries notorious Varulus. Who's better? Now, in the second satire, Juvenal makes reference to priests from the Great Mother cult, or the cult of Sybil, popular in what's today Turkey or Asia Minor, in those regions. Originally associated with the region of Phrygia, this Great Mother cult spread far and wide. She was to be found even in Rome, and Juvenal is writing in Rome. Someday you'll dare something worse than that clothing. No one's wholly corrupted overnight. Little by little you'll be received by those who at home in private wear wide bands on their brows, necks all decked out in jewelry, and placate the good goddess like women with a bowl of wine and a young sow's udder. But in a change to the usual rule, women are challenged afar and turned from the threshold, the goddess's altar open to men alone. Hence, you profane ones, they cry, no flute-playing girl with her mellow pipe here. Such secret rites were performed to torchlight the bapti accustomed to tiring the goddess, Secropian Cotito, if that is anywhere near the proper pronunciation of that. One man has blackened his eyebrows, moistened with soot, extends them with slanting pencil, and flutters his eyelids while applying the makeup. Another drinks from a phallus-shaped glass, his bouffant hair filling a gilded hairnet, dressed in a checkered blue or a yellow-green satin. And then continued on the next slide. While the master's servant swears by the feminine Juno. One holds a mirror, the Pathic, remember that's the homosexual, the Pathic Otho's constant companion, the spoils of Aruncian Actor, according to Virgil, in which he used to admire himself armed as he issued the order for battle. It's worth noting in modern annals and current histories, a mirror was essential equipment to raise civil war. It's the mark of a supreme general, of course, to kill Galba while powdering your nose, the maximum self-possession shown on Bebriacum's field to aspire to the Palatine throne, while your fingers plaster your face with a mask of dough? What not even Semiramis, the archer, in her Assyrian city tried, nor Cleopatra in Greece, in her flagship at Actium. Here there's no shame in their language or reverence at table. Here is Sibyl's foulness, the freedom to speak in a woman's voice, and an old, fanatical, white-haired man who's the priest of the rites, a rare and memorable example, an enormous throat, a gluttonous specimen, an expert well worth his hire. Why are you waiting? Isn't it time already to use their knives, to carve their superfluous flesh in the Phrygian manner? Now you can see from the quote that I've given you here how much embedded the text is in stories from antiquity, and you'd have to do some digging to get at some of the depths of what's being said here. But in general, he's talking about men who are dressing themselves up as women. And this last phrase, carve their superfluous flesh in the Phrygian manner, has to do with the priests of the Sibyl cult. And the next slide will say something about that. Everett Ferguson, I'm using here in this case, is Backgrounds of Early Christianity. He says, according to one of the myths associated with the cult of Sibyl, Zeus begat Agdistis, a wild creature half male and half female. So here's an androgynes, a male-female. Dionysus, the god of wine, made it drunk and tied its male member to a tree, so that on awakening suddenly from sleep it mutilated itself. From the severed male member an almond tree sprang up. Nana, the daughter of Sangarius, took fruit of the tree into her bosom and conceived Attis. The youth grew up and was about to be married to the daughter of the king of Pessinus. But Agdistis had fallen in love with him, and to prevent the marriage caused Attis to castrate himself. So you see, this myth is at the background of a practice in which the priests of the cult of Sibyl, upon becoming priests, would castrate themselves and thereafter dress as women, as we've been reading. Juvenal also describes a homosexual wedding. Notice that here is not homosexuality understood in terms of a one-night stand or wild sexual promiscuousness or the lack of commitment in a long-term relationship. But here's exactly what some people are proposing in our day. It's not as if we've just invented or come across something today that wasn't there in the past. And so when Paul is opposing homosexuality, it's not as if he doesn't have the possibility that this could be a variety of practices, including even this kind of commitment in a homosexual marriage. Juvenal says, Gracchus has given a dowry of 4,000 gold pieces for a horn player, or one perhaps who plays the straight pipe. The contracts witnessed, felicitations. A whole crowd asked to the feast. The bride reclines in the husband's lap. Oh, you princes, it is a censer we need. Is it a censer we need, or a prophet of doom? Would you find it more terrible, think it more monstrous, truly, if a woman gave birth to a calf or a cow to a lamb? He's wearing brocade, the long full dress, and the veil. He who bore the sacred objects tied to the mystic thong, sweating under the weight of shields. O Romulus, father of Rome, why has this evil touched the shepherds of Latium? Where is it from, this sting that hurts your descendants, Mars, the god of war? Can you see a man noted for birth, wealth, wed to another man? And your spear not beat the ground, your helmet stay firm, and no complaint to the father? Away then, forsake the stern campus's acres, you neglect now. I have a ceremony to attend at dawn tomorrow down in the vale of Quirinus. Why's that? Why? Oh, a friend of mine's marrying a male lover of his. He's asked a few guests. Live a while, and we'll see it happen. They'll do it openly, want it reported as news in the Daily Gazette. Meanwhile, there's one huge fact that torments these brides, that they can't give birth, and by that hang on their husbands, onto their husbands. But it's better that nature grants their minds little power over their bodies. Barren, they die. So Juvenal is not in favor of these practices, but he's reporting them as so widely practiced that he's afraid that the culture of his day is going to break out, and to the point that men are going to be marrying other men and announcing it in the local gazette. The difference between that culture and ours is only in this, and that is that now these homosexuals who marry or just are partners of one another are adopting children and having children or donating their sperm to women and so forth. And so the fact is that the families are being created in these homosexual relationships, unlike in Juvenal's day. Otherwise, we've really got the same thing going. And a lot of the literature around this has tried to say what Paul is talking about is not what we're seeing today in our culture. In actual fact, it's virtually the same, except that they also had other forms of homosexuality than the ones we have. It was further gone, and particularly the practice of pederasty was widely accepted. Now, another helpful piece of information comes from an astrological text in the 2nd century. The men, on the contrary, become effeminate. Malakoi is finally used here, and unsound with respect to nature. Kataphusin, which is a term Paul uses in Romans 1 in talking about homosexuality. Unsound with respect to natural congresses and the functions of women, and are dealt with as pathics, though privately and secretly. So basically, this astrological text is saying that depending on what's going on in the sky when you're born, you might end up being secretively a man-woman who enjoys sex with other men. And then from the 4th century AD, an astrological text makes the same kind of argument. So it's not just this one from the 2nd century. Philo, writing in the 1st century, also at Alexandria in Egypt, has the following to say. And he's not a Christian, he's a Jew. He's writing regarding the city of Sodom in Genesis chapter 18. He says, as men, being unable to bear discreetly a satiety of these things, get restive like cattle, and become stiff-necked, and discard the laws of nature, pursuing a great and intemperate indulgence of gluttony and drinking and unlawful connections. For not only did they go mad after women and defile the marriage bed of others, but also those who were men lusted after one another, doing unseemly things, and not regarding or respecting their common nature, and though eager for children, they were convicted by having only an abortive offspring. But the conviction produced no advantage, since they were overcome by violent desire. And so by degrees the men became accustomed to be treated like women, and in this way engendered among themselves the disease of females, an intolerable evil. For they not only, as to effeminacy and delicacy, and notice our word malakos is here, became like women in their persons. Note also that Polycarp in the 2nd century, a Christian, understood Paul to be using the word malakos in reference to sexual lusts, not something else. He says, in like manner, let the young men also be blameless in all things, being especially careful to preserve purity, and keeping themselves in, as with the bridle, from every kind of evil. For it is well that they should be cut off from the lusts that are in the world, since every lust warreth against the Spirit. Quoting from, possibly from Galatians 3. And neither fornicators, nor effeminate, nor abusers of themselves with mankind shall inherit the kingdom of God. That's our passage in 1 Corinthians 6:9. Nor those who do things inconsistent and unbecoming. Wherefore it is needful to abstain from all these things, being subject to the presbyters and deacons, as unto God and Christ. The virgins also must walk in blameless and pure conscience. So here Polycarp is interpreting Paul, but interpreting Paul to be speaking about lusts of the flesh and not some other kind of softness. Now, having done this kind of primary source research, one can then turn to see what other scholars have done. And the scholars would have presented their work in the primary sources in the same way that you could present your work from the primary sources. So the challenge here is not to begin with these theological word dictionaries or lexicons, but to do the work yourself and to then check your work with other scholars. In this way, you become a scholar like them and not dependent on their work. Obviously, in practice in ministry, you're going to use these resources a lot and not spend hours and hours doing primary source research. But you may find yourself on a committee someday in a denomination or in a church having to evaluate certain popular interpretations that some people who appear to be scholars are proposing. And if you were in the PCUSA or the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, or are in some denominations that are still exploring these issues, you may find yourself having to challenge the scholarship of big-name scholars associated with well-known seminaries or universities on an issue like the one facing us in this lecture and facing these churches today. So check your work. Don't make your work dependent on these secondary resources. Theological dictionaries are very helpful. In fact, they'll demonstrate how to lay out your word study, and will show you exactly what it should look like. So this is a good example to follow when presenting a word study. Now, examples of good theological dictionaries to consult for New Testament studies are Baltz and Schneider, Colin Brown, and Kittel and Friedrich. These three are the three of the top. And the one point to make very briefly here is that these are edited works, and therefore you need to cite the author and the article and not just the editor and the name of the volume, or the general work, the theological word dictionary. So you would cite whatever author it is in Colin Brown, what the title of the article is. It might be Molokos or Soft, and then you give the rest of the information here in a citation. So these would be things to get familiar with. These word dictionaries. There are others, and there may be others coming along, so you want to pay attention to what the latest research is. But don't become dependent on old single-volume works like this, like West's work, which is around in many an old pastor's library. Be aware of the more detailed and the more recent works. Kittel and Friedrich is really dated now, and it needs to be used very critically and not just accepted for what it says. But it is still an important work to be consulted. A very particular kind of study in primary sources for New Testament studies is the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. This is an example of intertextuality. What texts does an author have and use in writing his text? So we know, for example, that Paul, in writing 1 Corinthians, has a knowledge of the Old Testament and uses it authoritatively. So, is there a possible Old Testament background to our text in 1 Corinthians 6? Now, one thing to note about the word arsenokoitai in 1 Corinthians 6:9 is it's just not found in literature before Paul or outside Christian circles, referring to 1 Corinthians 6:9. Christians do use the word, and they use it when referring to 1 Corinthians 6:9. You could find that out by looking up the word in the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci and see who uses the word arsenokoitai or the word in some other form. What we find is that this term is to be found in the Old Testament in the Greek in a certain way, which I'll show momentarily. Paul's use of the Septuagint, it is the thesis, explains this compound word, and he probably coined it. And here's how it seems to have come about. There are two passages in the book of Leviticus and in that section called the Holiness Code of Leviticus that essentially say the same thing. 18:22 says, "And whoever lies with a man sexually as with a woman," and then in chapter 20, verse 13, "If a man lies with a woman as with if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them." Now look at the Greek, the Septuagint here, and you see in chapter 18, verse 22, arsenos, and then a few words later, koitain. Now look at the 1 Corinthians 6:9 word, arsenokoitai. This word is also to be found in Paul's letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1:10, in a sin list, just like the sin list of 1 Corinthians 6:9. Not just like in the sense that the same words are used, but some of the same words are used, and this is one of them. But more importantly, Leviticus 20, verse 13, has these two separate words, arsenos, koitain, right next to each other. And you might want to know an important point about how Greek was written in the first century and before. It was written in capital letters, without punctuation, and without space between words. And so it would be very easy, just as with our other Greek word where we have male, female, man, woman, to read these two words together as well. And that seems to be exactly how Paul did it. Not that he didn't know that the words were separate, but that he decided to join them. So the words mean male and bed. We might say something like men bedders, or men having sex with other men as with women. That then points to the meaning of the word by the fact that the words seem to come from Leviticus 20:13 and possibly 18:22 as well. Now, Brian Rossner, in his book Paul, Scripture, and Ethics, a study of 1 Corinthians 5 through 7, offers the following correlations of texts in Leviticus 18 through 20 and the two chapters 5 and 6 in 1 Corinthians. He says that when Paul talks about incest in chapter 5, he has in view some passages from the Holiness Code in Leviticus. He points to the reference to homosexuality that we've just gone over. Also idolatry in this time 1 Corinthians 10, verses 7 and following, with reference to Leviticus 18:21, and in 1 Corinthians 11:1, the call to imitate God from the Holiness Code 19:2. The saying, do not cause someone to stumble, from chapter 8, verse 9, seems to allude to Leviticus 19:14. And then the warning against spiritual prostitution in 1 Corinthians 6:12 through 20, once again to our chapters 5 and 6, coming from Leviticus 20, verse 5. All of these passages coming from the Leviticus Holiness Code, pointing out that Paul is using the law as he writes to the Corinthian church. And whatever we make of Paul and the law, we need to realize that it's not simply that he does away completely with the law, but it's more a question of how does he use the law as he addresses his churches. A recent work by Brian Rossner on Paul and the law explores this issue of Paul's use of the law further. Here, though, the point that I'm trying to make is that Paul does use the law, and this is not just restricted to the word that we find for homosexuals in 1 Corinthians 6:9, but rather there are various issues that Paul seems to use this holiness code for in 1 Corinthians. So then, what can we say about word studies, the meaning of malakoi and arsenokoitai, the historical cultural context? What can we say about the idea of Holocaust in antiquity? What can we say about Paul's use of the Old Testament in this case for Christian ethics, and even the law and the holiness code in 1 Corinthians? And then what can we say about scholarship on these subjects? So the previous lecture has gone over these different elements: the word studies, the historical cultural context, and the New Testament use of the Old Testament, and we've begun to engage somewhat other scholarship. Remember, we had various translations of 1 Corinthians 6:9 at the beginning of this lecture, and now we might return to that and ask, who has the better translation here? It would seem that our study of malakoi and arsenokoitai would suggest that these are terms that have to do with primarily sexual behavior. And in the case of malakos, it seems to be sexual behavior that can be associated with a certain posture or deportment in life. That is, one could identify a malakos male on the street, and that is a person who is soft. And so we have then these different possibilities of translation. Effeminate is just too vague a term in the NAS and the King James Version in our present culture and context. The ESV seems to be too limiting. Yes, homosexuality is there, but there's more going on than that. And then the NRSV is way off with its male prostitutes. It's far too limiting. And sodomites is very general. That's okay, but no longer a term that we would use in our day. It's difficult to render this nicely. And whatever choice one makes, it may require a footnote in a translation to give some further explanation. So now we return to the suggestions of Holtgren, Furnish, and on the next slide, Boswell. And here then we can see that they simply have not done their homework at all in their suggestions of what these terms mean. In fact, we saw that Boswell hid information in number 1, it's reference to Dionysius, where he didn't reference the two meanings that Dionysius gives. So this is simply to end this lecture by emphasizing the importance of your doing your own primary source research. And that concludes the lecture.